posterior teeth. In this lecture, I will explain the main differences between the posterior teeth and anterior teeth in general. Then I will move to the permanent premolars and explain the class traits or characteristic features of premolars, whether they are maxillary or mandibular. And finally, I will describe the buccal and lingual aspects of the maxillary first premolar. So let's begin. The permanent posterior teeth include the premolars and molars. We have two types of premolars, the first and second premolar, and three types of molars in each quadrant. The crown of the posterior teeth is characterized by having an occlusal surface as its masticatory surface rather than having an incisal edge or ridge as it's found in the anterior teeth. The occlusal surface is bordered by the raised marginal ridges, which are or which form or considered part of the occlusal surface rather than the lingual surface like anterior teeth. Also, we have two or more cusps. Also, there are developmental grooves, pits, and triangular ridges and other anatomical landmarks. As you can see in these figures, the marginal ridges are considered part. This is the mesial and this is the distal marginal ridge of a maxillary first premolar, considered part of the occlusal surface. The same thing is found in the mandibular first molar. This is the mesial marginal ridge and this is the distal marginal ridge. While in anterior teeth, the marginal ridges form part or considered as part of the lingual surface of these teeth. Also, we have two or more cusps. Here we have two cusps. In the mandibular first molar, we have 5 cusps. There are grooves. There are pits at the point or junction of many grooves. We have triangular ridges, foci, and so on. The characteristic features that differentiate posterior teeth from anterior teeth. Usually, posterior teeth in general have a greater facial-lingual or buccal-lingual dimension compared with their mesiodistal dimension. The only exception for this is the mandibular molars, where their mesiodistal diameter is more than buccal-lingual. While here for maxillary posterior teeth, maxillary premolar and maxillary first molar, the facial-lingual dimension is greater than the mesiodistal dimension. Also, posterior teeth characterized by having a shorter cervical occlusal length compared with the anterior teeth. As you can notice here, the length of the maxillary premolars is shorter compared to the maxillary canine or canine. The same applies for the mandibular premolars, which are shorter than the mandibular canine. Regarding the contact areas for posterior teeth, usually the contact areas are broad and located buccal to the center of the tooth. This is the center of the premolars and molars. As you can notice here, the contact points are located buccal to the center of these posterior teeth. And usually they are broad, while the contact areas, if you recall, in the anterior teeth usually are smaller and usually centered labiolingually on the surface of the crown. Also, regarding the position of the mesial and distal contact area of each posterior teeth, usually the contact areas are at the same level or nearly at the same level, both mesially and distally, compared with the anterior teeth where the mesial and distal contact points are usually at different levels. Regarding the curvature of the cervical line, posterior teeth characterized by less curvature of cervical line, both mesially and distally, compared with the anterior teeth. As it's shown here, the curvature of cervical line is much greater in the anterior teeth compared with the posterior teeth. Also, the location of the crest of curvature or crest of contour or height of contour, both buccally and lingually, is at different levels. For the anterior teeth, usually the labial and lingual height of contour was located in the cervical third. For the posterior teeth, the buccal height of contour is located in the cervical third, while the lingual height of contour is located in the middle third of the crown. Now, regarding the geometrical shape of the crown of posterior teeth, from facial and lingual aspects, all posterior teeth, just like the anterior teeth, have an outline or can be outlined by a trapezoid of various dimensions. In that, the shorter of the two parallel sides is at the cervix, and the longer of the two parallel sides is at the occlusal aspect, just like the anterior teeth. What are the advantages that can be obtained by having this geometric outline? First, it will provide a greater interproximal space to accommodate for the interproximal gingiva. As you can see here, we have greater interproximal space for the gingiva and the supporting structures. Also, it will create a space between the roots of the teeth to accommodate the root and the supporting bone and periodontal ligament. This configuration will provide contact area between teeth, whether anterior or posterior. Finally, it will prevent elongation of the antagonist teeth. For example, if the mandibular second premolar here was lost or extracted for whatever reason, the configuration of the teeth in this outline will prevent the opposing teeth, which are the first premolar and the second premolar, from over-erupting into the space of the extracted mandibular second premolar. What are the geometric shape of the mesial and distal surfaces for the maxillary posterior teeth? Usually these surfaces, or the outline of these aspects, can be included within a trapezoid, but the trapezoid here is inverted in that the longest of the uneven or parallel side is toward the cervix and the shortest is toward the occlusal plane. This will bring the cusps of the posterior teeth in the confines of the root. So what the advantages brought by this configuration? First, because the occlusal surface is constricted. As you could notice, the occlusal surface is narrower than the cervical portion or the root. This will enable the tooth to function properly, and the tooth can be forced into food material more easily. So this will provide better strength and support for the tooth to perform its function of mastication and chewing of the food. If the occlusal surfaces were as wide as the bases of the crown, in this case, excessive forces will be transmitted to the roots. Finally, this configuration helps to keep the tooth or provide self-cleansing quality for the tooth by drifting the food material away from the buccal and lingual surfaces of the teeth. While the mesial and distal surfaces of mandibular posterior teeth have a different configuration or geometric outline, these surfaces are rhomboidal in outline. This rhomboidal outline provides the following features. First, the crown will be, or the crowns of these teeth will be inclined lingually into proper occlusion with the opposing tooth. This configuration, as depicted in this figure, will keep the axis of the crowns and roots of the teeth of both jaws parallel. As you can see here, these are the line that passes through the long axis of maxillary posterior teeth and maxillary mandibular posterior teeth is parallel with the line of the force of mastication. Otherwise, if this configuration or the configuration was not like this, this will result in clash of the opposing cusps with one another and transmit a harmful force or strong or heavy forces to the supporting structures, which will lead to damage and destruction of these structures. So as you can see here, the mesial or distal aspects of the maxillary posterior teeth in the form of a trapezoid with the longest side toward the cervix, while the mesial and distal aspects of posterior teeth, mandibular posterior teeth, have a rhomboidal outline which will help in providing proper occlusion and contact between the mandibular and maxillary teeth. Now moving to the permanent premolars. The permanent premolars are 8 in number. We have 4 in each arch, 2 in each quadrant, the first and second premolars. Premolars are considered intermediate teeth between molars and canines. Usually they erupt between 10 to 12 years, and in many instances they develop or erupt before the canine. They are considered succedaneous teeth because they replace the primary first and second molars, so there are predecessors for the premolars, therefore they are considered succedaneous teeth. What are the common characteristics of premolars in general, whether maxillary or mandibular? These are called the class traits for premolars. First, the premolars are developed from 4, usually 3 buccal lobes form the buccal cusp. These are the 3 buccal lobes which form the buccal cusp, and 1 lingual lobe form the lingual cusp. Except the mandibular second premolar. The only exception for this is the mandibular second premolar, which is developed from 5 lobes. 3 buccal form the buccal cusp, and 2 lingual form the 2 lingual cusps. The premolars, as mentioned earlier, the premolars are of 2 types, first and second. Usually the first premolar is much more like a smaller canine, while the second premolar is much more like a small molar. So, whether maxillary or mandibular, the first premolar, this is a maxillary first premolar and this is a maxillary second premolar. The first premolar has a buccal cusp which is long and sharp. Therefore, they assist the canine, whether maxillary or mandibular, in its function of tearing. While the second premolars, whether maxillary or mandibular, have cusps that are less sharp and less pointed, make them more efficient as grinding teeth, much like molars. So the first premolars assist canine in their function, while the second premolar assists molars in their function of grinding food. All premolars have single root, whether maxillary or mandibular. This is the mandibular first premolar, except the maxillary first premolar, which are frequently bifurcated. Only the maxillary first premolars, in general, or in most cases, 80% of the cases, have 2 roots, buccal and palatal or lingual. Now moving to the permanent maxillary premolars. The maxillary first and second premolars usually resemble each other so closely. They have the same average dimensions and supplement each other in function. So what's the function of maxillary premolars? As mentioned earlier, premolars assist canines in piercing and tearing food with their sharp cusps. These are the maxillary first and maxillary second premolar. So the first premolar mainly resembles a canine and assists in tearing food. They also assist molars in grinding food during mastication because of their occlusal surfaces are broad and they have prominent cusps. Also, they help to maintain the height of the lower third of the vertical dimension of the face. The vertical dimension of the lower third is the vertical distance from the base of the upper lip to the lower border of the chin. This is called the vertical dimension of the lower face. So the presence of posterior teeth in general, whether premolar or molar, help to keep this dimension. If there are loss of a large number of teeth, usually the patient face will collapse and the patient will have reduced vertical dimension. Also, the premolars reinforce aesthetic during smiling. They do so less than the anterior but more than molars. If you smile, you can see that your maxillary premolars are visible during smiling. Therefore, presence of sound premolars will make your smile more aesthetic and pleasant. The identification features for the maxillary first premolar. This tooth have some unique characteristics. First, the maxillary permanent first premolar has two cusps, buccal and lingual. Both cusps are sharp and well defined, but the buccal cusp is 1 millimeter longer than the lingual cusp. Difference is 1 millimeter. The occlusal outline is angular and the buccal outline is prominent. As you can see, it resembles, from the buccal aspect, it resembles a smaller canine. The mesial slope of the cusp, this is the mesial. The mesial slope is usually longer than the distal slope, which is the opposite situation for that present in the maxillary canine. This tooth is the only tooth in the dental arches that have a developmental concavity on its mesial surface. This is called the mesial developmental depression. This is, as you can notice here, is a depression or concavity present on the mesial aspect of the crown and root, extending from the contact area through the cervical area and then to the bifurcation area of the root. Also, this tooth is characterized by the presence of what's called the mesial marginal developmental groove. This is the marginal ridge, mesial marginal ridge, and here it's notched by a small groove called the mesial marginal developmental groove. Also, the maxillary first premolar, characterized by having two roots, in most of the cases, in 80% of the cases, with two pulp canals. Usually the bifurcation is at the middle third of the root. However, in 20% of the cases, the tooth is presented with a single root, and also it will have two pulp canals, even if it has a single root. You can notice here the mesial developmental depression, which is very noticeable in this tooth or on this tooth. Detailed description of the maxillary first premolar from all aspects. Instead of the labial aspect for anterior teeth, the facial aspect of posterior teeth is termed the buccal aspect. So from the buccal aspect, the tooth appear very similar to the maxillary canine. This is the maxillary canine and this is the maxillary first premolar. However, the crown is shorter, as it's noticed here, is shorter than the canine and slightly narrower. The difference in length is about 1.5 to 2 millimeters. The maxillary first premolar is 1.5 to 2 millimeters shorter than the maxillary canine of the same mouth. The general outlines of the crown and root. This is the mesial and this is the distal aspect. Usually the cervical line has less curvature than the curvature found in the anterior teeth. Also, the mesial outline is slightly concave below the cervical line, then become convex at the broad mesial contact area, while the distal outline is straight below the cervical line, then it becomes convex around the distal contact area. The position of the mesial and distal contact area is usually at nearly the same level mesially and distally, and the mesial aspect is located just slightly occlusal to the center of the crown. This is the center of the crown, so it's just slightly occlusal to the center of the crown. Distally, it's located slightly a little bit more occlusal, but it remains somewhat in the same level compared with the different position of the contact areas between mesial and distal aspects in the anterior teeth. Also, the maxillary first premolar, unlike the canine, is characterized by having a mesial slope which is longer and straight compared with the distal slope, which is more curved and shorter. Also, the tip cusp of the buccal cusp is located slightly distal to the bisecting line of the buccal surface of the crown. So if we draw a line that bisects the crown from the buccal aspect, we can see that the cusp is located slightly distal to this line. Regarding the surface anatomy first, the relative dimensions of the crown and root. Usually the maxillary first premolar, like the maxillary canine, shows the difference between, or shows the following characteristic. The difference between the mesodistal diameter across the contact areas is 2 mm more than the mesodistal diameter across the cervix, just like the canine. The root, however, is similar in its outline to the root of maxillary canine, but it's shorter by 3 to 4 millimeters. Both the crown and root surfaces are convex at all points. In addition, the maxillary first premolar is characterized by a well or strongly developed middle buccal lobe. This is the line of demarcation between the three lobes, so this will result in the formation of what's called the buccal ridge, which extends from the cervical line to the tip of the buccal cusp. Here we have the mesio-buccal lobe, this is the middle buccal lobe, and this is the distal buccal lobe. We have slight depressions to the mesial and distal of the buccal ridge, which denote the demarcation between these three lobes. Regarding the lingual aspect, the main features, of course, the outlines, the cervical, mesial, and distal outlines are the reverse for those of the buccal or seen from the buccal aspect. The main feature is that the crown tapers toward the lingual. So the crown shows lingual convergence. It's narrower lingually than it's buccally. Regarding mesiodistal dimension, because the lingual cusp is narrower mesiodistally, as you can notice here, compared with the buccal cusp. Why? Because the lingual cusp developed from single lobe, not like the buccal cusp, which is developed from three lobes. The lingual cusp is spheroidal in shape, so it has less prominent outline compared with the buccal cusp, and it's 1 mm shorter than the buccal cusp, as mentioned earlier. Therefore, from the lingual aspect, the tip and the slopes of the buccal cusp can be seen. You can see the mesial, this is the mesial and distal cusp slopes and the tip of the buccal cusp from the lingual cusp, because the buccal cusp is longer than the lingual cusp. The lingual outlines, as mentioned earlier, are not as prominent. Finally, the lingual aspect of the crown is smooth and convex at all points. The same applies for the lingual aspect of the lingual root if two roots are present, or the lingual aspect of the root if single root is present. Also, as mentioned for the crown, all surfaces are smooth and convex at all points. In the next lecture, I will continue discussing the remaining aspects of the maxillary first premolar and also the detailed description of the maxillary second premolar.